aka the Preston Outdoors Podcast. In this week's episode, we're going to be talking about jigs. We haven't really talked about them at all or anything like that, and we're going to kind of keep it simple, stupid, I guess you could simply say. What I want to talk about in this week's episode, we're going to go over few different head styles and different kinds of jigs, and then I want to talk about my favorite style of jig and why I think it's a great generalist jig. Covers a lot of cover and stuff, and like I said, just my overall favorite. It's, I think, a jig head style that's not talked about a lot because, one, you can use it in a lot of different scenarios. So the companies, I feel like you can use it in a lot of different scenarios, so companies don't want to promote that because then they can't get you to buy multiple different styles of jig heads for cover. And two, it's not real sexy looking, I guess you could say, from a marketing standpoint. So we're going to go over that. You guys are listening to this podcast. I'm already down in Tennessee. I'm filmed it a week before here because we're going to be down there practicing. Just finishing up here the Thursday before you're listening to this on Tuesday. Doesn't really matter. But I'm packing up, get everything down there. When you're listening to this, it'll be the week I'll be down in on Pickwick in Tennessee and the border between Tennessee and Alabama. But yeah, if you're watching on YouTube, I'm actually in the studio here up in my house. And if you guys haven't already, and if I talk about something that isn't related or you can't see the visual kind of thing, go ahead and check out this episode on the Preston Outdoors YouTube channel. It will be up there on a normal uploads, just like our podcast is, because I've got some jigs here in hand that we're going to be talking about and explaining things. Otherwise, I'm going to try and do my best to talk about them if you're listening to it on the normal podcast platform. But once again, my name is Ethan Preston. This is the Preston Outdoors Podcast, and every Tuesday morning we do an upload. And if you like to watch the video to see the actual visual aesthetics and stuff like that, the video will be up on the Preston Outdoors YouTube channel relating to this podcast. And then every Thursday at 3 p.m. Central Time, we have a YouTube video that goes out on the Preston Outdoors YouTube channel. So we try and stay regular and stay on a schedule and stuff uploaded with that. So without further ado, let's get into jigs. So I guess I should preference this conversation or this podcast episode to talk to anybody that maybe not know what a jig is. Up here in the North Dakota, Minnesota area, when someone thinks of a jig, you think of a jig in plastic. Normally it's a round ball jig head, normally used for, say, walleye fishing. But we're going to be talking about bass jigs in general for people that are new to bass fishing, or people that have dabbled in bass fishing, or maybe even some people that do bass fish a lot like myself. Maybe you'll learn something here. So for instance, what I'm showing up here to the camera here is a Straight King swim jig. Basically, we're going to talk about different head styles and stuff, but I want to show you what a jig is. It is predominantly lead, okay, lead head, as you can see here. And then you've got a weed guard of some kind, a little bit different than, say, a walleye jig. You've got a hook, sometimes a bait keeper, sometimes not. And then you have mostly predominantly made up of a silicone skirt. Okay. So there you have it. That's a jig. All right. Most of the time you'll put some kind of plastic trailer on the back there. So what I want to talk about is a few different head styles of jigs. And this will, I don't know how to say this. This is something I've been thinking about for a podcast episode for a long time, actually, and it's a great time to actually get this out. I was packing my tackle, and a great time to actually pull these out and look at them. So we're going to talk about different head styles, say pros and cons of each, and then we're going to talk about my favorite jig and why. And I think it'll save you a lot of money. First off, what I held up here is a swim jig. Okay, you're going to see it's going to have how do I explain this? It's going to have a pointed head, almost like a bullet. Okay, you're going to see how pointed that is. Again, if you're listening on the podcast, it's more of a cone-shaped portion of it. So the wide portion of your cone is back towards where the skirt and stuff attach here. But this jig is supposed to come through cover a lot better. When you cast it in there, it's going to, some people even maybe punch with these jigs, stuff like that, because it's got the pointed tip. Using a heavier one comes through. But a lot of times these jig, again, is a swim jig, is they're swam through cover. Any kind of cover. We're talking, most of it's like wood, rocks, some, but vegetation, a lot of it, vegetation can mean anything from bulrushes, lily pads, any aquatic vegetation, any weeds. This head is pointed and it's supposed to come through that cover a lot better, kind of, hitting a blade of grass or a cattail or something and then kind of bouncing off of and going around it instead of really getting snagged up with it. So the swimming jig positivity is that, it can be thrown in tighter cover. It comes through cover a lot better and stuff like that. So a lot of guys use this to swim. They call it swimming a jig. So you have a swim jig. Another jig head that is very, very predominant when you're talking about jig fishing is a football jig. So if you can imagine a football, then turn it sideways and put a hook behind it, basically is what it is. So you see it's got a real wide shape. I can show that here. It's got a real wide shape. It's got a football shaped head there. Some come with a vertical and some come with a horizontal line tie. So horizontal should run this way. This one's a vertical line tie. Some places say that you want one or the other depending on the cover you come over with. For me, it's not that big of a deal. It's not something I get super carried away with. I just don't know. There is positives to it. I understand that the horizontal line tie actually pulls the jig over cover and stuff like that. Some people make it a bigger deal. To me, it's not that big of a deal. So again, there is no absolutes in fishing. Okay, most of the time I have some too that are smaller. This happens to be a 3/4 ounce football jig. I make this one myself. So this is the actual jig that I threw down in Lewisville, Texas last year for the Bassmaster Central Open on Lake Lewisville. Caught a few keeper fish on this. We'll do different episodes on talking about each specific jig, but I want to give you a generalist episode here first. So there you have it, football jig. This one comes through rocks very well. It does not skip a hole very well, just because the head shape. A swim jig will skip a little bit better because it's got a flatter chin on there and the way it's designed. With the football jig, it just doesn't come across. This one might skip a little bit better because you can see there, it's got a flat portion of it. This is supposed to be a stand-up football jig. So this head will sit and kind of stand up for you. This one might skip a little better, but generally a football jig does not skip very well. It doesn't come through cover very well. Most of the time they're used around rock, and that wide cheeks on that football jig won't get snagged up and come through rocks real well. Another popular style is called an archy style jig. So it's like a teardrop almost. Show you here. Give you that jig head profile. So almost like a teardrop in a way. The top where the eye loop is the bolder, wider portion of the jig. And then as it goes back to where the jig skirt touches, it is the thinner portion of it. And this one, archy style, is really popular for skipping because it's got that flat head on there and it's kind of rounded, so as you can see here, it'll skip very, very well. It also can be swam because it's got that more pointed tip on there, so it can be swam through cover. So getting all that done, let me just preference this by saying all these jig heads are specialists and elitist, meaning that a football jig will go through rocks and stuff like that, per se, better than a swim jig. A swim jig will swim through cover and maybe skip decent, or will skip better than a football jig. Swim jig will go through cover better than a football jig. Football jig's a master around rocks. But then say for skipping, an archy style will be better than a swim jig. Most of the time, a swim jig is casted out with either a craw trailer on the back or some kind of paddle tail, little miniature swim bait trailer. It is predominantly supposed to mimic bait fish. So I have a white one here that I'm showing off, and this one obviously would be across the country for shad. White colors do work up in the North Country. Don't think just because we don't have shad up here that they won't work. They will still work. Swimming them, the lighter, a lot of people say the lighter the swim jig, the better, because then they can keep it higher in the water column and they can move it slower. So a lot of people use the 1/4 ounce, 3/8 ounce swim jigs. 1/2 ounce swim jigs are used to be deeper in the cover or moved a lot quicker. So your football jig around rocks and stuff like that, like I mentioned before, wider head. These baits, a lot of times using the big bulky jigs, would be used on large rock, like points or rock structure. This head, when it wobbles back, when it goes back and forth, will kind of cause that trailer to kick back and forth, just because it's just like when you roll a football. It doesn't roll straight. It wobbles back and forth exactly like that. That's kind of how it walks underneath the water through the rocks. A lot of people, I shouldn't say a lot of people, but for the most part, most of these times are crawling. You're not really fishing a football jig very fast. You're dragging it or maybe hopping it some through cover. These big football jigs are fished predominantly offshore, meaning away from the shore or on structure. Your underwater points, your underwater rock piles, even maybe through some submerged trees or stuff like that. Or brush piles, anything like that. But a lot of times if you're fishing them offshore, people are throwing the big ones, like an ounce and a half. One, they can get down deeper, and then two, they give away a big profile. So this one, if you're listening, you can't see this, but I have strands of living rubber. And if you're watching this on YouTube, that is these portions here. So when this gets wet, this rest of it's the light brown that I have in here. I have a living rubber and a silicone skirt in here. It's kind of the combination of the two. The silicone will puff up a little bit, but this living rubber is actually, like I said, it's not silicone, it's rubber. So it really expands. So if this thing touches the bottom, all these tentacles in this skirt go really, really big. And so when you move it and then stop it, it'll puff back up. And you move it, and stop it, it'll puff back up, giving a very large profile for this bait. A lot of people will throw some kind of slower trailer on there, either a twin tail grub, or I have kind of this is a Preston Outdoors 4-inch creature bait on here. It doesn't have much action to it, but you don't use much action because you're kind of crawling this bait. A lot of scent is used in a football jig. Either people use dip and dyes or they spray them with different kinds of garlic, crawfish scent, shad scent, whatever. Because since this bait is moving so slow on the bottom, a lot of times the fish will come up to it and nose up to it and then look at it a little bit more because it is moving so slow. So the added scent to it, since a fish has a lot of time to look at it, people add scent to it. Arky style, people do swim these. Like I said, they are skipping predominantly well. Most of the time, people will add up. This is a little bit smaller trailer here. It's still that 4-inch. I've trimmed it down, but it's a 4-inch Preston Outdoors creature bait. And what they do here is a lot of time is an active trailer. People aren't dragging this as much, I would say, because they're skipping it under docks. You're skipping around laydowns. I've skipped them into bulrush patches because you can't cast over top because it's growing up later in the summer, and you just can't do that. So what they do is you skip it. How do I do it? Right across the top of the water. A harder technique to learn, but it works. And so since this is an active style, you can use more of a kicking trailer or a trailer like this that doesn't have much action to it. Just depends on what you want to do. So all of these have their places they shine. They're specialists. Again, we talked about all that. And each person can definitely use these baits to get across what they want to accomplish. And just look at this here. So then getting them what to accomplish. So here's the problem. You're going down the bank. You come across a rock pile on shore. You want to throw a football jig. Then you go 20 yards later, you find some submerged vegetation, bulrushes, lily pads, hydrilla, whatever you have in your area, and you want to swim a jig. So then you go to the next spot, and then there's a dock, there's a laydown, there's a brush pile or something up along shore, and you want to skip it. So just in that scenario, in a 50-yard stretch, you've got to have, if you want to have all these jigs, you've got to have 3 different rods with 3 different of these jigs set up for the most part. I'm not saying you can't fish either one of these jigs in different scenarios. I'm just saying they're a specialist, they're elitists in their group and what they want to use for. So if I'm a jig making company, I make 3 or 4 different head styles of jigs that are specifically in tuned for what cover I want to fish. One that's good for business because me as an angler, or you as an angler, are going to have to buy 3 different head style jigs for each one. Drink a Mountain Dew there. So you got to have multiple styles of jigs around, which is fine. You go out to your home lake and you say, Ethan, all I got is whatever, and I throw a swim jig a lot. So you just have a swim jig tied on. That's fine. Or I've got tons of rock. I'm going to do this. Like, there is instances, again, nothing in fishing is absolute. But in my opinion, each one of these are elitists, and they are the best in the certain scenarios that they hold into. Again, you want to have the best jigs coming through the right cover, but there is times where I like to call it a generalist jig. And we're going to talk about this, my favorite jig head style. Because in the lakes that I fish, those 3 scenarios I showed you or talked about, those 3, now there are all other kinds of jig heads out there. I just don't, these are just 3 jig heads I talked about, and then my favorite. There's all kinds of, each company kind of designs their own style jig head. Some are better for brush piles, some are strictly for skipping, some are structure jigs, and they just have different names for them. So these are just the broadest ones that I've seen on the market and fish a jig quite a bit. But we're going to talk about my favorite style, and I didn't even know this existed until I started YouTube and Googling when I wanted to make my own jigs here at home. And that is the brush jig. So here's the brush jig. If I can show you that head style there. This is the jig that I got started fishing or started making here at my house. Now, I'm going to try and explain this the best, but you can see this on the YouTube feed here. But let's look at it. So we've got a vertical line tie, just like the swim jig here. Now I got both of these held up together. I'm trying to see if I can see what I'm showing you. But you see how this is pointed? And then if this one's tipped, this one is pointed. So it's got a pointed somewhat nose, cone style shape head as the swim jig. Okay. Now we're going to look at the flat underside here. It's got a flat underside, so it can stand up, and I'll show you here if I can hold my balance enough here. It'll stand up on my hand. I'm showing it to the camera now. It's standing up. I've got it on the palm of my hand. So sometimes it'll stand up like a football jig if you got the stand-up football jigs. But I want to talk about that here in a little bit. But see this flat underside here. Okay, see that flat underside? The Arky style jig is a little bit more curved, but it's got a flat underside as well. So then we go to the back side of the chin here. Holding the skirt back to show you guys here, the back side of the chin. Remember we said that it's pointed at the top and wider at the bottom. Now the back side of the chin, you can see it kind of does the opposite. It gets wider or whatever, but then here there's a cheek, I call it, and then a cheek on the other side. So it kind of widens out towards the bottom. You know, it doesn't come to the cone and stop like the swim jig, but it gets wider at the bottom. What does that resemble? Somewhat of your football jig, because the football jig's got those wider cheeks on each side. Not obviously this one isn't as wide as the football jig, and it's not as pointed as the swim jig, and it's not as flat in skippability as a Arky style jig. But this jig is the one that I use 90% of the time. Now I pour my own swim jigs, I pour my own football jigs, and I pour my own Arky style jigs. So it's not that some people would say, well, you have your own brush jig molds, that's why you throw it more. No, I have all the other ones, okay? This is still the one I use the most. Reason being, it is a generalist. It does not swim through cover as well as a swim jig. It does not drag on the bottom as well as a football jig. It does not skip as well as an Arky style jig. But guess what? It does all 3 of those things I want it to do. So if I'm going down to the bank, which I find myself doing a lot of the times with the jig, I got dock, I got hard structure, I've got overhanging structure to skip, I've got weeds and stuff like that. And I need this jig, instead of me picking up a rod every 5 casts and switching it, which at some point maybe I will, I don't know, maybe I'll be able to have enough rods to be able to do that. But right now I don't, and I haven't had that enough rods like that for a long time. And so I call it a generalist because it's going to be able to attack every single portion of that cover that you run across and do it a good enough job until you run into yourself into a situation to where maybe you need a specialist jig to fit. If you're going to be fishing a lot of whatever we've talked about before, aquatic vegetation, rock, or trying to skip under a lot of cover, then maybe you need to pick out one of the specialist jigs. I find myself a lot of times fishing around and I'm not around a specialist situation. So this generalist brush jig helps me out a lot. I skip this under docks. I have casted this and drug this around just like a football jig, and I've swam it through cover. So what I do with this jig a lot of times is, excuse me, I'll throw it out there. And if we're going to say we're pitching bull rushes. So sometimes they have a flipping jig. It's more of a pointed style head that goes in and out of cover real nice. just like this brush jig does. So I throw it in there, it hits the bottom, I hop it once, hits the bottom, hop, hop, hits it twice. Okay. Fish didn't bite. All right. So what I've done in the past is I'll slowly swim it back to the boat. So I flipped it in there like a pitching jig, and I've swam it back to the boat like a swim jig. And I've gotten a lot of bites swimming this back to the boat. So now I come across a dock or a lay down, meaning a tree in the water, or like I said before, bulrushes where they're heavy on top. You can't really flip into it, so you've got to skip it in there. So you skip that thing right up underneath there, gets in there, falls to the bottom. Okay. It may not skip as well as the Arky style, but it still allows me to skip it up underneath the cover, hop, 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 nothing. I swim back to the boat. Come across, now I'm going down the bank, I'll come across a point, or I see some rock, a rock sand transition, and I want to drag it. Throw it out there and just drag it in, maybe give it a hop, drag it in, give it a hop. So the point I want to get across in this episode is there's a million jig styles, million brands, million jig heads out there, and that's fine. And at some point, you may need that jig head style to suit your fishing situation. That is fine. I'm just saying that if you find some brush jigs and you mix those into your certain situation, if you're having not the problem, but if you're in the same situation that I have been in for the last few years, is I'm in a generalist, the cover changes a whole lot in some of the lakes that I fish in North Dakota, Minnesota. I mean, I fish my brush jig all across the country. I take them, I was in Texas, Oklahoma, and Alabama last year. And I actually caught my first ever spotted bass on a 1/2 ounce black and blue brush jig fishing along riprap in Neely Henry Reservoir in Alabama. It's the first spotted bass I've ever caught in my life. Wasn't very big. It's 2 pounds, but I was fishing riprap with it, meaning rocks and stuff like that, because we went to a riprap section, but before that we were flipping wood in practice for it. So I've caught fish all across the country with this, and if you're kind of on a budget, I wouldn't even say on a budget. If you're kind of like me and I want to try and get the most out of each jig or lure and stuff like that, I do the same thing with my rods. We do a total episode on this. There's some of my favorite rods that I have are ones that I can do multiple techniques, multiple styles on one. So that way any situation I find myself in, I don't have to have super technique specific rods that I feel won't be able to be capable of multiple different types of techniques and multiple different types of situations. That's why I always start off with the brush jig. Now, like I said, it doesn't do everything better than the heads that are specifically designed for that. And if you're just getting into jig fishing and you've come across a lot of cover and a lot of stuff like that, don't be afraid to pick up a few jigs, brush jigs, and throw them around a little bit instead of just going out. It's so intimidating. It's just like crankbaits with all the fancy colors that they have or anything like that in fishing. Sometimes it can be too intimidating for somebody that's getting into it because there are so many different options, and you can watch all kinds of YouTube videos. You can read all kinds of articles like I did as well. And when I first started throwing a jig, I threw a football jig, because that's all the pros talked about was a football jig. So I went and picked up some Strike King football jigs, and I tried skipping them under docks. And you want to know how that went? That went like poop. Ping! Yes, it would skip like once and then shoot up. Hitting docks. I hit some pontoons, and I backlashed like crazy because it wouldn't go across the top. I tried swimming this through cover, and it did all right, but then there'd be times it would get caught up in the bulrushes all nasty and stuff like that. So then I threw a swim jig a little bit. I tried dragging that on rocks. I get stuck in trees. I mean, I was all over the place before I came down to this system of throwing a brush jig. Now, it did also help that when I started really looking into making my own jigs, something I'd always wanted to do, probably 4, 5, 6 years before I ever got the stuff, I wanted to make my own jigs. I just thought it was too intimidating and it would take too much time. So I just go to the store and buy them for $6, $7 a piece, $5 a piece, whatever they were. So Do It Molds had a brush jig mold. So I Googled what a brush jig was, and I was looking around, and nobody really came out and said that this was a generalist jig. People just talked about that they loved them. So it was like an entry-level style of jig head. So I went ahead and purchased the mold and came out with it. And after I poured a couple, and then I was just seeing how how it was going. I think it was a couple $100 investment that I did in the lead, the mold, you know, all the paint and the skirting material. Anyways, to get it all done, hooks, everything of the integral parts of the recipe, you could say, to come together to make this jig. I started fishing with it because now I made my own jig. So of course I'm going to fish with it a crap ton. I love fishing with jigs anyway. So this was a lot of trial and error before I really came to this opinion, and before I really shared it with everybody, is that the brush jig head, the way it's designed, from pointiness to wide base with the cheeks like a football jig, pointiness like a swim jig, and the flat side that allow it to stand up, allows it to skip real well. And this is just my opinion, like a lot of this stuff is on this podcast, but it's something else that you guys can look at. And if you've got any questions or anything like that, or if you want me to talk about anything specifically, we always touch back on for this podcast, you can send an email to Preston Outdoors with the number 2 at gmail.com, or send me a message on Instagram, or go to the Preston Outdoors website. We have a blog post on there where you can leave any kind of comments. There's a link to the podcast episode, and there is a comment section underneath there if you want to leave comments about shows that you want us to talk about or dive into deeper. But I mentioned something in the beginning. We've talked different techniques and stuff like that on the show, but there's going to be times where I want to talk about something that's maybe more entry level for people that are listening to fishing. We're going to talk about different kinds of species at times, but everything that really comes into my mind. And a jig, when I was putting my jig boxes away, like, I just love them. I love the way they look. I don't know what it is about them, but that's what I'm saying. So this is an opinion I've given to on live shows, I've given to on other people's podcasts, but never really done it on a public platform with my, my stuff here. So it's definitely a great thing to look into, is the brush jig, because I've got a lot of questions about people asking, what kind of jig do you love to throw? Or what's your favorite jig? And I may be biased, but I like the ones I make. But it's the jig head style that I really like better, is because it's so unique. One, because you don't hear about it a lot. A brush jig isn't nothing new. Like, it's nothing game changing or I just developed or anything like that. That is completely false. The brush jig molds are mass produced on Do It molds all the time. And people like me who run their own tackle business, I don't run my own tackle business, but people like me have bought molds and done their own skirt tying, their own painting, and can do it as fancy as they want to. Have brush jig heads. I'm just saying, if you're getting started into it, or if you're looking for a jig head that will make you not overthink it as much, maybe just go ahead and react to the situation. That's where a generalist who's decent at everything, what do they say? A generalist is decent at everything, master of none of them. Well, that's kind of like a brush jig is. It's good at everything, but it's just not a specific master of each. So if you're going to compare a swim jig head to a brush jig head, the swim jig is going to be better at the one thing, maybe a little bit worse at the other. Football jig, one thing, worse at the other. Skip and jig, Arky style, one thing, good at the other. So for me, I try and use as many, like I told you this before, this jig head allows me to use multiple different styles of cover that I'm fishing and targeting for bass. And it doesn't have to be just fishing shallow. I've caught smallmouth bass on this as well. I told you I got a spotted bass on this. You play with your skirt colors, whatever forage and the cover that you're fishing around. But it just allows me to not overthink things. And I think with the fishing industry, with everything in life in general, doesn't matter. You are presented when you walk into a tackle store, you see a wall of jigs, a wall of plastics, a wall of crankbaits, and you go, oh my gosh, where do I start? And if you're like me, I like to buy fishing tackle. So I'll go one of this, one of this, one of this, one of this, one of this. And then I kind of, at the end of the year during the season, I kind of sit down at some point and look through my tackle boxes and say, what have I used? What have I not used? A lot of it comes down to plastics that I have. What haven't I used? What have I used? And most of the time I'll just keep them in there for a while. I've carried 3. There's 3. I just loaded up the boat, or the truck from the boat. There's 3 Shields bags, plastic bags, whatever, full of random plastics that I've held on for the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And I've never thrown them, but I picked them up at one time. So it's the same thing with the jigs. If you're looking into buying something like that, look into something that can do it all and then go from there. It'll help you save a lot of money, might help you be more productive on the water, and then it's more productive on your pocketbook. So instead, I don't want you to have the same problem I had. Basically, is another thing I want to talk about. I didn't want you to have the same problem I did, is go ahead and buy a football jig and dink it off the dock every time because it's not made for skipping, or get it snagged in trees and snagged in vegetation because I thought I could swim this through stuff, and you still can, but I'm saying it's not as good. And so I was like frustrated with like football jigs. They really catch them. Like I caught a ton of fish just flipping a football jig, but it wasn't as productive on the water as I was hoping it would. But all I had read was in the Bassmaster magazines, them catching them on a jig, using a jig. Fish is a jig. Jig is a big fish lure, big fish technique. And I was like, I want to try and throw a jig. So I bought the football jig, caught fish, and that got me the love of fishing with it. And so over the years, I do have all these styles in my tackle box, but each one's really specific for the cover I'm fishing, time of year, stuff like that, except for the brush jig. That is the one that if I'm going to go out and do anything, I'm going to a brand new lake, whatever. If I'm bass fishing, there is going to be, especially largemouth fishing, there's going to be a jig on my deck. And 99.9% of the time when I'm starting off, unless I know the cover that I'm going to fish already, there is a brush jig on my deck. Now, if I'm going to a lake that's got a lot of docks on it, and I know I'm going to be skipping a lot, I'll probably have an Arky style jig tied on. If I know I'm going to a lake where I'm going to be fishing more offshore rock or rock in general, I'm going to have a football jig tied on. But at that point, I'll probably have two jigs tied on. I'll have the brush jig and then whatever the specific one is, kind of thing. So that's kind of my opinion about the whole jig scenario. This episode is going to be a little bit shorter, I think. But let me know what you think. If you're a bass fisherman or looking into get bass fishing or anything like that, I really, really revel and appreciate and look forward to the feedback that you guys have here. I can do episodes later on, diving into each jig and be more specific on each, but kind of like the Generalist brush jig, I wanted to keep this episode pretty general on that. And it's something that I've repeated over and over and over and over again. Like I said, on lives, on other podcasts, to people in face-to-face, people I've taken fishing, people I've fishing with, the brush jig is just, it makes sense to me. And that's one thing I wanted to convey to you guys. If you go to the tackle shop or you go somewhere online and you're looking at these jigs, maybe look at something that's maybe it doesn't look as sexy. Like if you're going to pull these up, I'm holding up the brush jig and I'm holding up the football jig. The football jig looks more sexy. Like it just does. To me, the head style, it looks like it means business. Like there's going to be something done with it. The swim jig's pointy like a bullet, everything like that. And then you've got the Arky style. It's got that teardrop, bell shaped on the bottom, good for skipping, whatever. The brush jigs is kind of the ugly duckling mix of all three, and it doesn't look as good, but it definitely catches fish. So again, I guess I'll talk about this before we end up. Brush jig, most of the time I'm not throwing a paddle tail or swim bait on the back of this. I'm throwing some sort of craw bait. I have thrown in the colder water, or I don't want any action on the fall. I've thrown the Preston Outdoors creature baits on here. This one doesn't have any kicking action. Or you can throw something like the Guggen Baits Kraken Craw, Guggen Baits Bandito Bug, Strike King Rage Bug, or any type any type of craw style creature bait that's got a lot of kicking action. It twitters the tails, or the craws kick when it falls. So if I want to slow the fall of the bait, I will use something with the kicking action, because it displaces water. It slows the bait, not a lot, but it slows my jig down a little bit. And if I want to be, I almost consider it more aggressive, because it's kicking and it stays in the strike zone longer. So a lot of times I'm using a kicking action trailer on this, because it stays in the strike zone longer, displaces a lot of water, and stirs up the area. But if it's colder out and I want my jig to fall faster and hit the bottom, and I think they're sitting on the bottom, I'll throw one of those style baits like this creature bait, or any kind of style plastic that doesn't have a lot of kicking action, like I think a Reactions Innovation Sweet Beaver, or a brush beaver, anything like that doesn't have a lot of kicking action. It doesn't displace water when it falls. So then your bait gets to the bottom quicker if I think they're hanging out. I'm thinking a lot of bulrushes, or even lily pads or lay downs, trees, stuff like that, to where if they're higher up in those weeds, if you have it deeper, or higher up in the trees, if you have it deeper. And a lot of times if I'm throwing the straight baits, you throw it down and you get bit. Like as soon as it hits the water and about a quarter of the way down there, you get bit before it hits the bottom. A lot of times either those fish are staying up in your water and your jig comes here and they snap it, or they're kind of feeding up a little bit. So if I'm getting bit, a lot of times you got to notice your bites. If I'm getting bit before my bait hits the bottom and I start hopping it, if it hits the bottom and I hop it once, hop it twice, whatever, the bait really isn't getting far off the bottom. It hits, hop once, hop twice, and I'm getting bit on the hop or on the bottom, I know the fish are towards the bottom of the water column. If I know they're up, I will then, if I'm not using it already, I will then have a kicking trailer or go to a little bit lighter jig and throw it in there. And then those fish are, say this is your bottom, fish are up here in the water column and they're sitting here. It slows the fall down so it sits in the strike zone longer, because a lot of times if they're eating that, there will be some fish or individuals will do things a little bit different, but they won't go to the bottom to feed off the bottom when your jig is hopping. They want to hit it when it's coming down like this and they snap it. But if you notice that, okay, you've got a little lighter jig or you've got the kicking trailers, takes a while, gets down, and then you're hop, and you're always getting bits on the hops or on the bottom, then you know it might not be a bad idea to go a straight, non-kicking action trailer, get that jig down there quick. And a lot of times if you use a heavier jig, I like a 1/2 ounce. Predominantly that's what I'm using starting off, is a 1/2 ounce brush jig. When that thing hits the bottom, it'll fall faster. It can either catch those fish off guard and they'll snap it in a reaction bite, or you hit the bottom, it displaces some sediment in there, hop, and then you can catch them that way. So pay attention. Little tip for you: pay attention to where your bites are coming. Now, if some are coming in the water column, some are coming in the bottom, then you're just going to have to hang on for the ride and figure there's fish spread out in different areas doing different things. But sometimes where your bite comes on the fall of your bait can definitely tell you what's going on and can clue you into something a little bit closer. So even a plastic switch or a switch in heavier or lighter jigs can definitely, you'll get bites. Like if you're just fun fishing, have fun, don't want to switch it up, you'll get bites. But if you want to take it to that next level for tournament fishing scenario, or really whack 'em fun fishing, beat your buddy in the back, he's throwing the same thing you are, but you're going to get 3 bites to his 1 kind of thing, or 2 to his 1 just to beat him. Pay attention to those things. And then I will always say this: experiment. Time on the water has brought me to the conclusion as of right now that the brush jig is my favorite jig to use for multiple scenarios. Okay. This came over, I've been pouring my jig since 2016, 2017. So 4 or 5 years, something like that. And I fish a jig a lot. I have time on the water. It has allowed me to come up with a hypothesis, or the idea that the brush jig is my favorite jig to throw for multiple scenarios. So play around with those things, experiment, try things, fail a little bit, go back to catching them. But there it is, the brush jig, my favorite jig to throw. And it's something that if you're getting into jig fishing, I said, or have jig fish for a while, something along that style of jig head, I think could be very productive for you. That's my opinion. And yeah, once again, Tuesday mornings, we have the P.O.P, aka the Preston Outdoors Podcast, uploads every Thursday at 3 p.m. Central Time. We have a new video on the YouTube channel, Preston Outdoors YouTube channel. Don't forget, you can, if you're listening on the podcast forum and you want to see me visually talk about these jigs or anything else, or the guests we have on there, if you want to see it visually, the podcast video will be up on the YouTube channel on Tuesdays as well. So you can watch it instead of listen to it, or do both, that kind of thing. Also, if you're listening to the podcast, if you don't mind leaving a review on whatever podcast platform you're listening on, it'll help me out a lot. Young podcast, we're only a few weeks into it, but I really hope we can keep this thing going. Another thing, I'll mention it until I turn blue in the face: your interaction and ideas and what you guys want to listen to, you reaching out to me. I don't care if you're a friend of mine. I don't care if you're a family member. I don't care if you're a complete stranger. I don't care if you're listening to this to be nice and hope it grows, or you're actually getting good information out of this, which I hope it's the latter. Reach out and let me know a podcast episode that you would like to hear. for the most part, we're going to be talking fishing here through the most part of the summer. Then come fall, we're going to be talking about hunting, fall fishing, and stuff like that. But I want to keep it transparent, and I want you guys to definitely be interactive, because it makes it a lot easier for me, and then I can make sure I'm getting you guys good information. So I want to thank you guys for listening. I want to thank you guys for watching. If you really like this jig series or anything like that, I've definitely got a lot more entry-level bass fishing, walleye fishing videos that I want to, or podcast episodes that I want to portray to you guys. We're also going to be trying sometime this summer. You can reach out and let me know. I've told this on a couple of my Instagram and TikTok lives. I want to do a some night of the week, maybe 2 times a month, 1 time a month. I want to go live on YouTube, and I'm going to be on the water, and I'll be breaking down either a new lake, a familiar lake, but breaking down what I'm looking at in the fishing scenario to go out and catch fish. I think everybody can learn a lot more. I mean, just like everybody watches the Bassmaster Lives, BPT Live, anything like that, you learning something on the water. I think it'll be a great thing for people. So let me know if that's something you guys would be interested in as well. So thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And thanks for tuning into the P.O.P, aka the Preston Outdoors Podcast. We'll catch you next week, and stay tuned.